They sent swarms that blotted out the stars. We sent 8 people and a bad attitude. The briefing lasted 4 minutes. That was how long it took for Colonel Vance to explain that Pluto was lost, that the arachnid hive front had overrun 3 research outposts in 72 hours. That plasma discharges had been detected from the surface capable of punching through low-orbit transport hulls, and that command was sending a single mobile infantry squad to go down there and, quote, assess and contain. 4 minutes. Private Johnny Rico spent the entire debrief staring at the word contain on the overhead display and wondering what exactly 8 people were supposed to contain on a planet the size of a frozen rock hurtling 4 billion kilometers from the sun. He got his answer 26 hours later when the drop pod punched through Pluto's thermosphere and the blackness outside the viewport filled up with things that were not stars. The arachnids on Pluto were called plasma bugs by the intelligence officers who had never actually seen one. Troopers who had seen one and survived called them something else, something shorter and involving profanity. They were the size of school buses, and they moved like liquefied nightmare, 8 limbs working in that horrible fluid coordination that made your eyes refuse to believe what they were tracking. The plasma discharge sac on their dorsal carapace glowed a deep arterial red when they were charging a shot, like a coal being brought to life. And when they fired, the bolt left a streak across the sky that Rico's brain refused to classify as light, because light didn't sound like that. Light didn't sound like the air itself being split open. 2 minutes to drop zone, said the pod's automated voice, serene as a hotel concierge. Next to Rico, Corporal Doc LaCroix was checking his medpack for the 4th time in 20 minutes. Across the narrow aisle, Private Isabel Dizzy Flores had her eyes closed and her lips moving around words Rico couldn't hear. She did that before every drop, some kind of personal ritual she'd never explained and nobody had ever asked about, because you didn't ask about those things. Sergeant Francis Bruto was cleaning his Merita rifle with the kind of focused aggression that suggested he was imagining it was someone's face. In the rear, Lieutenant Gene Rozak sat perfectly still with his artificial left arm resting across his knee, the one he'd come home with from his first command, the one that was all he'd come home with from his first command. And wedged into the corner seat by the porthole, silent and utterly alien, was Tafai. Rico had been trying not to look at Tafai since they'd been assigned. The skinny, that was the name for Tafai's species, though it was technically a slur, the kind that had become so ubiquitous it was now just a name, was 7 feet of elongated gray limbs and a face that never did anything a human face would have done in the same situation. No tension before the drop, no checking of gear. Tafai simply sat and breathed in that triple rhythm his species used and looked at nothing. He was here because Command had decided that the arachnids were Tafai's problem as much as humanity's. That reasoning made sense in a briefing room. In a drop pod punching toward a planet swarming with things that would eat them all. Without distinguishing between species, Rico found it harder to feel collegiate about it. 1 minute, Dizzy opened her eyes. She caught Rico looking at her and smiled. That fast, crooked smile she'd had since they were 15, the one that said, yeah, this is terrifying, and yeah, we're doing it anyway. Rico looked away before the smile could make him feel anything he didn't have time to feel. The pod hit atmosphere and the world became noise. They landed 3 kilometers from the primary research station in what the tactical map called a low-threat insertion corridor, and what Rico's eyes told him was an open plain of frozen nitrogen plains studded with methane ice formations, under a sky that wasn't quite black and wasn't quite purple, with a sun that was just a bright star like any other star, and absolutely no cover worth mentioning. Move, said Rozak, and they moved. The temperature outside the suits read -217 degrees Celsius. The suits handled it. The suits handled a lot of things: atmospheric pressure, radiation, the fact that the air was poison. But Rico had learned in his first deployment that a suit that handles everything has an unfortunate tendency to make you feel invincible right up, until the moment something the suit wasn't designed for removes your head. He kept low, he kept checking the 6. They found what was left of Outpost Kepler at the edge of a methane ice shelf. It had been a research station for 18 people studying Pluto's subsurface geology. The arachnids had been through it maybe 12 hours ago. Rico had seen bug-hit sites before, but Kepler was something else. Not just the destruction, but the efficiency of it. The bugs hadn't been feeding. They hadn't been establishing a hive node. They'd been clearing the way. Every structure was collapsed inward with the kind of deliberate geometry you only saw when something was making space, not just taking it. Whatever the arachnid hive-mind had planned for this stretch of Pluto, they were building up to it, and Kepler had been in the way. "LaCroix," Razak said quietly. "Do a sweep." "Already on it, sir." Doc moved through what had been the main lab with his scanner out, professional and calm in the way medics got professional and calm, because the alternative was useless. He didn't say what they all already knew, he just logged it and moved on. Razak stood in the center of the ruin and looked around. Rico had been watching the lieutenant long enough to read the small tells, the slight tension in the jaw, the way the artificial hand made a very slow closing movement, and then opened again. Razak was angry. Not the hot kind of angry that made you careless. The deep kind that made you careful in the wrong direction. "We push to Station Copernicus," Razak said, 3 kilometers north-northwest. "Intel says there may be survivors." "Intel said Kepler had 18 survivors 24 hours ago," Bruto said, not quietly. "Then let's not give Copernicus 24 hours. Razak looked at Bruto with the particular expression he reserved for those moments. Flat, patient, completely without compromise. "Move out," they moved. It was Tifis who spotted the first one. He said nothing. He simply stopped walking and extended one elongated arm to the east, and the squad froze because the suits transmitted tactile signal, and the lieutenant's hand was up before anyone had consciously decided to stop. Rico crouched behind a methane formation the size of a car and brought his Merida up and saw nothing but frozen plains. Then he saw it. The warrior bug came over the ridge at the kind of speed that had no right to exist in something that large. It was 12 feet at the shoulder, all armored chitin and articulated killing machinery, and it moved without sound because Pluto had almost no atmosphere to carry sound, which meant your first warning was visual, and by the time you had visual it was already committed to the intercept. "Contact east," Rico said, very calm, the way you got calm when calm was the only option. "One warrior, 30 meters in closing." "Take it," Razak said. Rico shot it. The Merida discharged 3 pulse rounds in 8.4 seconds, and all 3 hit center mass, and the warrior bug did not slow down. It covered 15 meters while Rico was processing the fact that it hadn't stopped, and then it hit the methane formation he was hiding behind, and the formation, 2 tons of methane ice, exploded outward like it was made of sugar. Rico was in the air. He came down on his shoulder, suit taking the impact, rolling, getting his legs under him, with the kind of automatic physical response that training had buried deep enough to survive the higher brain temporarily going offline. The Merida was still in his hands. He brought it up. The warrior bug was standing on the rubble of the formation with its primary claws working, and its sensory cluster tilted toward him in that horrible attentive way they had. Like a dog hearing a sound, except the dog weighed 6,000 pounds. And everything it was currently processing was how to unmake him. Then Dizzy hit it from the flank with a full auto burst, and Doc dropped a frag grenade under its thorax, and Bruto put a rocket in its face, and the warrior bug went down in 4 seconds of very loud cooperative murder. The silence after was remarkable. "One," said Tafai very quietly, from behind a rock formation 30 meters back. Rico looked at him. "One what?" "One more behind the ridge." He was right. The second one came over the ridge 20 seconds after the first died. This one was different, not a warrior. Smaller, faster, and it moved like it was thinking. Like it knew where the guns were pointing. It came at an angle that put Bruto and Doc between Rico and a clean shot, and it hit Bruto in the side at full speed, and they went down together, and Bruto was shouting and the bug was on top of him. Rico had the shot for approximately 0.8 seconds. He took it. The pulse round caught the bug in the anterior sensory cluster, which the intelligence briefings described as a sublethal shot zone. What this meant in practice was that the bug was hurt and angry and momentarily disoriented, which gave Bruto the 0.8 seconds he needed to get his combat knife into the joint between its thorax and neck section, and make several forceful arguments about the value of letting go. The bug let go in both senses. Bruto sat up with bug ichor all over his left side, and his expression doing a complicated thing that was mostly rage with an undertone of deeply offended dignity. "Are we done?" he said to no one in particular. "For now," Razak said. He was already looking north. "Copernicus, move." They found the survivors. Copernicus Station had sealed its pressure hatches when the first attack hit Kepler, and the 4 researchers inside had been living in a 2-room pressure habitat for 31 hours on recycled air and protein bars, and a level of psychological fortitude that Rico found genuinely impressive. The station lead, a geologist named Dr. Amara Chen opened the inner airlock door and looked at the squad with the expression of someone who had made peace with dying and was now being asked to unmake that peace very quickly. "Your mobile infantry," she said. "What gave it away?" said Dizzy. "We need to get you out," Razak told her. "What's your situation?" "3 of my team are still functional. 1 is not." She meant alive and dead without saying the words. "We have detected subterranean activity on the North Plain. Seismic signature consistent with tunneling. A lot of tunneling. Whatever they're building down there, it's big." Razak was very still. "How big?" Chen pulled up her research tablet and showed him the seismic map. Rico looked over the lieutenant's shoulder, and the word that came to his mind, which he did not say out loud, because there were civilians present, was unprintable. "They're excavating a hatchery," T-Fi said from the doorway. Everyone looked at him. He came into the room, had to fold himself to fit through the door, and looked at the seismic map with something in his expression that Rico couldn't parse. Not fear, not exactly. Something older and more considered than fear. "My people have faced the arachnids before the Federation made contact with us," Tafi said. "The excavation pattern is consistent with a primary hatchery complex. If it matures, this entire region of Pluto becomes a permanent arachnid forward base. They will launch plasma from the surface at anything approaching. The Federation cannot retake this planet without first eliminating the hatchery." "Can 8 people eliminate a hatchery?" Doc asked. "No," Tafi said, "a beat, but they can collapse it," Tafi said. "If they know the correct structural point." Razak looked at T5 for a long moment. Then he looked at Rico. Rico was not sure what Razak saw, but whatever it was, the lieutenant nodded once. "Tell us," Razak said to Tefei. The plan that Tefei described was not a good plan. It required going underground. Into the tunnels the arachnids had excavated, into the dark below Pluto's frozen surface, into the place where the bugs would have every advantage, and placing demolition charges at a specific structural node T-Phi identified from the seismic data, and then getting out before the collapse. The radius of the collapse, based on Phi's calculations, would cover approximately 400 meters of tunnel network. "How much of a head start do we need?" Dizzy asked. T-Phi considered. "More than 8 minutes. How long will we have?" "Between 4 and 6 minutes." "That's not a head start," Bruto said. "No," Tefai agreed. Bruto stared at him. Then he looked at Razak. "With respect, sir, this is insane. We're fighting giant bugs on Pluto," Doc said. "We're all insane." Bruto's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Rico. Rico looked back and offered the very slight shrug that said, "Yes, I know. And no, I don't have a better idea either." "Find me a tunnel entrance," Razak said. "Chen, can you give us a seismic overlay on our tactical maps?" "Already transmitting," Chen said. They left the researchers in the station. They didn't discuss whether the station would still be standing when they came back. Some mathematics were better left uncalculated. The tunnel entrance was a crack in the frozen plain 200 meters north of Copernicus, barely large enough for a suited trooper to drop through sideways, which was exactly how they went in. One by one, into the dark, into the arachnid-smelling cold. Tefai went through last with the ease of his longer limbs. And then they were all underground, under 2 meters of frozen rock, under Pluto's dead sky. And the tactical lights on their suits were the only light in the world. Rico had never been underground with bugs before. It was different. Above ground, the arachnids were a tactical problem. You could see them, you could calculate angles, you could pick cover. Underground, in their space, in the tunnels they had made with their bodies, they were something else. They were the place itself. Distributed through the dark the way a city is distributed through its own streets, and you were not a soldier moving through their territory so much as a foreign object inside a living body. The tunnels were warm. Pluto's surface was negative 217 degrees. 20 meters down, the temperature was reading -8. 50 meters down, it was positive 12. Something down here was generating heat. Something biological, something that didn't need a sun. "Stay close," Razak said very quietly, and nobody had any argument with that. They moved for 11 minutes without contact. The seismic map pointed them deeper and north, and the tunnels widened as they went. From crawl space to corridor to something that was almost a chamber, lined with chitin deposits that caught the helmet lights and threw them back in fractured rainbows. The arachnids built the way coral built, or the way a city built, layer on layer on layer, the accumulated architecture of a hive mind that thought in geological time. Then Tefai stopped. He raised one hand. The squad stopped. In the silence, Rico heard it. A sound that was quite sound because there was not enough air down here for real acoustics. More a vibration in the rock and in his suit's contact sensors, a rhythmic pulse that was not mechanical. It was breathing, or the arachnid equivalent, something big, very close, asleep or dormant. Tafai turned and put 2 fingers to the side of his helmet, the skinny equivalent of a pointed look, and then pointed at the floor. He meant down. The structural node was below them. The problem was that between them and below was approximately 40 meters of tunnel that the breathing was coming from. Razak assessed this for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a long time for Razak to stand still. Rico, Flores, flank left, Bruto with me. Tafai, lead us to the node. The thing that was breathing was a tanker bug. Rico had read about tanker bugs in the briefings. He had seen one in training footage, recorded from a Federation engagement on Hesperus. He had understood, intellectually, that they were large. Standing now at the mouth of a side tunnel with Dizzy, pressed against the wall beside him, and the tanker bug occupying a chamber the size of a gymnasium 30 meters away, he found that large was a word that had failed its responsibility. It was curled in on itself the way cats curled, which was the most disorienting thing Rico had ever seen, because nothing about the tanker bug otherwise resembled anything comfortable. Its carapace was thick enough to stop everything in his Maritas magazine, and that was before you factored in the plasma reserves it carried internally, which the briefings had described as sufficient to dissolve a medium combat vehicle. It was asleep. Its sensory clusters were folded. Its breathing, its subvocal pressure cycling, whatever the correct word was, filled the chamber with that subsonic rhythm. Dizzy was watching it. Her hand found Rico's arm and gripped once, not fear, not asking for reassurance, just acknowledgement. I see it too. I see it too. They flanked left. Tafai brought Razak's group to a secondary shaft that dropped 17 meters straight down, through a plug of chitin-reinforced ice to the structural node. Razak went first, using the suit's gecko grip, and Rico heard the click of his descent through the comms, and then Bruto's heavier footsteps following. Then Tafai, who moved through the shaft with a different kind of comfort. This was not his world either, but it was closer to his instinctive geometry than it was to a human's. Rico and Dizzy held the chamber mouth and watched the tanker bug breathe. Doc, Rico said on the closed channel. How are we on time? Charges take 90 seconds to place, Doc's voice came back, steady. Fee is marking the nodes. We've got maybe 5 minutes before the hive mind registers an intrusion this deep. How do you know 5 minutes? I don't, but the lieutenant used 5 minutes, so that's what we have. The tanker bug shifted. It didn't wake. It moved the way large sleeping things moved. Vast, unconscious adjustment, redistributing weight, one limb extending slightly. But the extension brought the anterior end of it 12 meters closer to the tunnel mouth, and the sensory cluster that had been folded was now partially extended, passive but present, the way a sleeping person's ear would still hear their name through a dream. Rico didn't breathe. Dizzy didn't breathe. The tanker bug's sensory cluster rotated 1 degree toward them and stopped. The 90 seconds that followed were the longest Rico had ever experienced. He was aware of the cold in his suit's extremities, the heating system working against the planet's ambient pull. He was aware of the methane smell that the environmental systems were filtering and failing to entirely filter. He was aware of Dizzy's grip on his arm, which had not loosened. He counted his own heartbeat, because it was something to count. Then Razak's voice, very level in his earpiece. Charges are placed. Begin extraction. The tanker bug woke up. Not all at once, not the way an alarm goes off. It came up out of sleep the way something that large has to. In stages, systems coming online sequentially, sensory clusters unfolding, limbs shifting to weight-bearing configuration. But it was fast, faster than it should have been. And the moment its primary sensory cluster fully extended and oriented, it oriented toward them. Go, said Rico, and they went. Behind them, the tanker bug began to move, and the chamber shook with it, and the tunnel they were running through shook with the vibration of something 6 stories tall, coming after them through rock and chitin and frozen nitrogen. They hit the shaft. Razak and Bruto were already up. Tafai was halfway. Doc was at the top, reaching down. Rico went up in a controlled scramble, suit's gecko grip doing the work his arms couldn't have managed. And Dizzy came up right behind him, so close. Her boots nearly hit his helmet, and at the bottom of the shaft the tanker bug arrived, and looked up at them with its sensory cluster, and made a sound that the suit's audio sensors registered as a compression spike, significant enough to trigger the damage warning indicator. Go, Razak said. Timer's running. Move, they ran. Through the corridor, through the chitin-lined tunnels, back the way they'd come. Tafai set the pace, faster than Rico expected. The skinny's longer stride eating ground. Bruto was breathing hard. Doc was counting under his breath. The tunnel behind them was vibrating. The tanker bug navigating toward them through passages that were too small for it, which would slow it. Which was the only thing that would slow it. How long, Dizzy asked. 90 seconds, Tafai said. He sounded absolutely calm. Either that was composure, or skinny, threat response physiology was very different from human. Rico suspected both. 90 seconds until we need to be where exactly? The entrance shaft. How far is the entrance shaft? 200 meters. Rico did the math. He did it in about half a second, and the result was not reassuring. We're not going to make it. We might, Tafai said. At this pace? Not at this pace. Tafai glanced back, which given his neck flexibility meant an almost full reverse rotation that Rico's spine protested by proxy. The tunnel we passed. 30 meters back, left branch. Where does it go, Doc? Doc checked his seismic map while running, which was the kind of multitasking that only worked when your alternative was death. It goes north and up. It surfaces, he paused. It surfaces 40 meters northwest of the entrance shaft. That is better, Tafai said. Or it's collapsed, Bruto said. It is not collapsed. I can hear the pressure differential. Tafai was already turning. Follow me. The left branch tunnel was narrower than the main passage, which meant the tanker bug would not follow them into it, which meant they were trading certainty of pursuit for uncertainty of exit. Rico made this calculation while running and decided it was a trade worth making. The tunnel narrowed. The tunnel narrowed further. Bruto was swearing, continuously, in the focused monotone of a man who swears as a mechanism for not panicking. Doc's scanner was up. Tafai moved ahead with the confidence of someone following something Rico couldn't detect. That pressure differential. Some form of echolocation he hadn't known Skinnies possessed. Something that was simply not a human faculty. Then the tunnel bent upward, and the gradient changed, and they were climbing and the temperature was dropping. And 30 seconds later Rico saw light. Not suit light, not the fractured chitin rainbows. Actual light, the dim, far-distant light of a sun that was just a bright star, coming down through a crack in the rock overhead. Up, said Defy, they went up. Through the crack, barely wide enough, and then they were on the surface of Pluto, on the frozen nitrogen plain, under the not-quite-black sky, and the ground was already vibrating underfoot with the deep rhythmic compression of several tons of tanker bugs somewhere below them. How long, Razak asked. Doc checked 42 seconds, move north now. They ran. Pluto's lower gravity helped. Each stride covered more ground than it would have, which in other circumstances would have been interesting. Now it was just survival physics. The surface was uneven, methane ice formations every 20 meters, and Rico was running between them and counting down in his head and not thinking about the research station and the researchers and whether the radius of 400 meters of tunnel collapse would. The ground dropped. Not everywhere, not catastrophically. A section of the plane, approximately 60 meters in diameter, sank with a grinding subsonic rumble, and then the center of it cratered inward, and a column of pressure and vaporized methane ice and flash-frozen nitrogen punched up through it like a fist, and the shock wave hit Rico from behind and picked him up, and he was briefly in Pluto's negligible gravity at an uncontrolled angle, and then he came down on the frozen plane and the suit's impact system distributed the load, and he rolled and stopped and lay on his back, and looked up at the star that was the sun. The vibrations below his back slowly stopped. He turned his head. Dizzy was on her feet already. Of course she was. And she was looking back at the crater with an expression that he recognized. The post-action inventory. Checking whether you're hurt. Checking whether anyone else is hurt. Cataloging the world with fresh eyes to make sure it still exists. Doc was up. Tafai was standing very still, which Rico had learned meant he was listening. Bruto was sitting with his knees up, and his arms on his knees and his head hanging forward, and he was swearing very quietly in a tone that was more meditative than angry. Razak was standing. He walked to the edge of the crater and looked down into it. The hatchery complex was not down there anymore. The tunnels were not down there anymore. Whatever had been sleeping and growing in the dark below Pluto's ice was not going to wake up. Tafai, Razak said. Lieutenant. Your calculation on the structural node was accurate. Tafai considered this. It was consistent with arachnid construction patterns. I was not certain. But you were right, yes. Razak looked at the alien. In the not-quite-black light of Pluto's eternal false night, with the crater still settling behind them, and the star-sun making shadows that didn't look like shadows from home, the lieutenant's expression was impossible to read. And then he nodded. the sharp, single, definitive nod he used when something had been decided. Good work, Razak said. Tafai's sensory clusters shifted in a way that Rico was beginning to recognize as surprise. Among a species that didn't show surprise on their faces, it was in the small things, the shift in posture, the reset in breathing rhythm. He had not expected those two words. None of them had, really, but they'd all heard them. Rico looked at Tafai and thought about the drop pod, and the way he'd looked at the alien when they were waiting to punch into atmosphere. All that armed wariness, all that species-level distrust, dressed up as tactical caution. He thought about T spotting the second bug, and T5 finding the pressure differential in the tunnel, and T5 standing next to him on the ridge of a frozen dead planet, with a hive mind trying to eat them all. Hey, Rico said. T5 looked at him. Thanks for the navigation assist down there. T5 looked at him for a moment that was slightly too long. Then you are welcome, Rico. Not private, not trooper. Just Rico. The way his squad used his name. The way Dizzy used it when she was being serious. And Doc used it when he was being careful. And even Bruto Yuda used it on the rare occasions when Bruto was being something other than loud. Bruto got to his feet. Someone want to call this in? I'd like to be off this frozen rock before something else tries to eat us. On it, Doc said, already pulling the comms unit. Copernicus first, Razak said. We get Chen and her team. Then we call in extraction. They walked back across the frozen plain, the 8 of them, in the direction of the station. The crater behind them had stopped settling. Above them, the star that was the sun gave its thin geometric light to a sky that still had no color and no weather and no atmosphere worth speaking of. And the silence of Pluto was so complete that Rico could hear his own breathing inside his helmet, steady and present and alive. Dizzy fell into step beside him. She didn't say anything. She pulled her canteen from her suit's side holster and offered it, without looking. The way you offered a canteen to someone you'd been doing this alongside, long enough that the gesture didn't need explanation. And Rico took it and drank and handed it back. 18 people in Kepler, he said. Yeah, we got Chen's team. 4 more. He didn't say the math. She knew the math. The point of doing this work, the point of the math, wasn't to come out even. It was to keep the number from growing. You couldn't save the 18. You could make it stop at 18. You going to trust him now? Dizzy asked. Rico knew who she meant. He looked ahead to where Tafai walked at the front of the group beside Razak, those long gray limbs adapted for the lower gravity in ways that made the skinny's stride look slightly wrong and slightly elegant at the same time. Think I'm getting there, Rico said. Dizzy nodded. That was enough. When they reached Copernicus and Dr. Chen opened the inner airlock door again. She looked at the 8 of them with an expression that went through several stages. Relief, calculation, relief again, and then she looked past them at T5, and to her credit she only paused for a moment before she extended her hand. Thank you, she said. T5 looked at the extended hand. Then he reached out with one of his own, longer, gray, 3-fingered, and took it and held it for exactly the amount of time a handshake lasted, and let go. I was told, T5 said carefully, that humans do this to establish trust. That's right. Does it work? Chen looked at him. Then she looked at the crater visible through the station's porthole, and then back at T5. I think you already established that, she said. The extraction ship came in 40 minutes later. 2 dropships, M-class, dispatched from Psycon's orbital position when the demolition charges registered on the seismic array. The pilot of the first ship, a woman Rico didn't know, popped the cargo door and looked at the group coming across the frozen plain and didn't say anything until they were all aboard, and the door was sealed behind them. Then she said, Command is going to want a full debrief. Command can take a number, Bruto said. The pilot looked at Razak. Razak looked at Bruto. Bruto looked at the ceiling. We will provide a full debrief, Razak said. The ship lifted. Through the viewport, Pluto's surface fell away. The nitrogen plains, the methane formations, the crater where the hatchery had been. From above, the crater was a clean circle, very precise, a mark in the frozen rock the way a period ended a sentence. From altitude, Rico could see the scattered geometry of what had been Kepler Station and what had been Copernicus Station, and the long, unbroken distance between them that they had covered on foot with bugs at their backs, and a plan that hadn't really been a plan so much as a collection of very determined people choosing to move forward. Tafai was sitting across from him in the transport bay. The skinny's long limbs were folded in the way that looked uncomfortable to human eyes, and was apparently perfectly natural to his own. His sensory clusters were at rest. He was looking at nothing in particular, which Rico had stopped reading as detachment, and had started reading as the skinny version of sitting quietly with your thoughts. Rico leaned back against the bulkhead and closed his eyes. He felt the vibration of the ship's drives through his shoulder blades. He felt the shift in gravity as they climbed through Pluto's negligible field and into the cleaner microgravity of transit. He felt the deep ache in his shoulder from the impact with the methane formation, which the suit had absorbed most of, and his body had absorbed the rest of, and which Doc would have him in the med station about for approximately 45 minutes after they landed. He felt tired in the way you only felt tired when the thing you'd been sustaining yourself through was done. He thought about the 18 in Kepler. He thought about Chen saying thank you, and Tafai holding out his three-fingered hand and asking whether it worked. He thought about Dizzy's grip on his arm in the tunnel beside the sleeping tanker bug, not asking for anything, just acknowledging. I'm here, you're here, we're both still here. He thought about Razak's face at the edge of the crater. Good work, the lieutenant had said, and said nothing else, because nothing else needed to be said. The lieutenant understood that some things didn't benefit from elaboration. Rico opened his eyes. Tafai was looking at him. You have a question, Tafai said. It was not quite a question itself. Rico considered denying it. Yeah, he said instead. Ask it. Your people faced them before. The arachnids, Rico leaned forward. How long did you fight them before the Federation found you? Tafai was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet, considering quiet. The difference was in how he held himself, which Rico was learning to read the way you learned to read anyone's body language, if you spent enough time in close quarters with them. 11 years, Tafai said. We lost 9 cities in the first 3. We learned. What did you learn? That they do not understand individuals. Tafai's sensory clusters shifted. The hive mind calculates mass, numbers. What it cannot calculate is what one person does when they have already decided. It does not understand that kind of decision. Rico thought about the tunnel, about the tanker bug waking up, about Tifei turning and leading them through the left branch without certainty, without a guarantee, because the calculation said it was better than the alternative, and Tifei had made the calculation and moved. You already decided down there, Rico said. Tafai looked at him with the faint sensor cluster shift that Rico was beginning to understand, was what Tifei did instead of smiling. I was not the only one. The ship broke through the last of Pluto's haze and into the clean black of deep space, and the planet fell away beneath them, and the star that was the sun was just a star, and it was very quiet, and the squad of 8 people who had gone down into the dark and come back out again were all present and accounted for, and alive, which in this war was not a small thing. It was the only thing. Bruto broke the silence by opening his ration pack, and the smell of reconstituted coffee filled the transport bay, and Doc immediately said, How do you still have coffee? You've been rationing since Hesperus. And Bruto said, I never share my operational assets. And Dizzy said, that is the saddest sentence ever spoken in the mobile infantry. And Razak looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man surrounded by people he would die for, which was technically the same as the expression of a man surrounded by people he would live for, depending on the day. Rico caught Tafai looking at the ration pack, with what he had initially read as indifference, and now read as a very careful attempt to not look curious. It's bad, Rico told him. Tafai's sensory clusters shifted. Then why do they want it so much? Beats me, Rico said. We just do. He leaned back against the bulkhead again. Outside the viewport, Pluto was a dark shape getting smaller, and the belt was ahead. And after the belt was the inner system, and after the inner system was Earth. And somewhere in the space between where they were and where they were going was the next campaign, and the one after that, and all the campaigns they couldn't see yet from here. But right now there was the vibration of the drives, and the smell of bad coffee, and 8 people alive in a metal box in the dark, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was exactly the kind of enough that the arachnid hive mind would never be able to calculate, because it required being a specific kind of creature, the kind that understood what it meant to choose to stay, to choose to go down into the dark, to choose to bring your people back out, the kind that had a word for the feeling of being alive when you expected not to be, the kind that made bad coffee taste like victory. Rico closed his eyes again and let the drives carry him home.